Let's begin with a word of prayer. Gracious God, as we conclude this season of Easter, we're reminded that each day is a celebration of the resurrection of your Son. Help us to be enlivened in that spirit and strengthened for your mission. Bless this time together. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right. We are here at the end. We finished the actual verse-by-verse stuff last week. We have done, this will be the 21st session for 28 chapters. So unbelievable that we did there. We made it. And if you remember, through each section of the book, I had played a video. The Bible Institute did a video of the sections of the book of Acts. And so this is the last section. I want to show that video that covers the final 7 chapters, so hopefully will serve also as a review here today as well.
We've been exploring the book of Acts, which was written by a man named Luke as a continuation of the Gospel of Luke. Acts began with Jesus telling his followers to spread the good news about his kingdom.
And they would start in Jerusalem, then go out into the neighboring regions, and from there to the ends of the earth.
Now, in Jerusalem, their message was received by many and opposed by many, especially by the leaders of the temple. They were scandalized by this new claim that the whole story of Israel had been fulfilled by Jesus' life, death, and resurrection.
One of these leaders was a man named Saul of Tarsus, who worked tirelessly to stop the movement. That is, until he met the risen Jesus himself. And this encounter transformed Saul from an enemy of Jesus into a herald of his kingdom.
And so for years, he traveled about the Roman Empire using his Roman name, Paul, starting Jesus communities all over.
And one of Paul's greatest desires was that all of these diverse communities would see themselves as one unified people, regardless of their differences, Jew or non-Jew, male or female, slave or free.
Jesus was creating one unified family of equals living together under his rule.
And this brings us to the final section of Acts. Back in Jerusalem, where the movement began, the Jewish followers of Jesus were suffering from a drought and food shortage.
And Paul was so passionate about the church's unity that he began a major fundraising project among the diverse churches he had started. They would pool their money together so he and a group of representatives could take it as a relief gift to Jerusalem.
But it's not safe for Paul in Jerusalem. The Jewish leaders there dislike him so much they want him dead.
And Paul knew he was walking into a trap. His friends all begged him not to go, but no one could stop him.
Yet why would Paul risk his life to bring this gift? Couldn't he have sent someone else?
Well, for Paul, this was personal. Jerusalem was where he used to participate in the murder of Jesus' followers, and now he gets to serve them. It's also where Jesus himself was executed, and so for Paul, it would be an honor to suffer there alongside his king.
Paul goes to Jerusalem, and as expected, he's found by his enemies. A mob forms, and they try to kill him. But Roman soldiers save his life by taking him into custody.
The Jewish leaders are accusing Paul of starting a revolt against Rome, but they can't prove it.
And the Romans don't know what to do with him.
Yeah, they can see Paul's not a criminal, but his claim that a crucified Jewish man is the risen king of the world, it keeps getting him into trouble.
And so Paul gets transferred from one court to another until he demands that his case be tried before the court of Caesar in Rome. And so they happily ship him off.
Now, throughout this section of Acts, Luke, the writer of the story, has portrayed Paul's trials and imprisonments so that they resemble his previous stories of Jesus' trials and imprisonment. Luke's making an important point. When the people of Jesus follow the way of Jesus, their stories will begin to look like his story, which is beautiful, but it also comes with a cost.
On the way to Rome, the boat carrying Paul is hit by a violent storm, and everyone freaks out.
Except for Paul. He's below deck hosting a meal, just like Jesus did the night before his trial. Paul blesses and then breaks the bread, promising that God is with them through this storm. And the next day, the ship hits and then breaks apart on the rocks, but everyone's washed safely ashore.
Which is amazing, but Paul's not out of trouble. He's taken to Rome and put under house arrest.
But it's not so bad. In his house, he can host groups of Jews and non-Jews, sharing with them the good news about Jesus, the risen king.
This is a bold move in Rome, the center of power where Caesar rules the world as king.
Yes, You have Jesus' alternative upside-down kingdom now growing in the very heart of the world's most powerful empire, all through the suffering of a prisoner. And with this contrast between kingdoms, Luke ends his story.
That's a great image, but the story's supposed to be about this message spreading to the ends of the earth. So shouldn't it continue?
Of course, Luke has left the story open-ended on purpose, so that his readers would know that the story isn't over, and that they can participate in Jesus' kingdom that is still spreading to this day.
Okay. I don't know if they've done other books of the Bible, but I think they've done a master job on the book of Acts, the Bible Institute, of putting these videos together. I think they're great synopsis, not too long, just concise and hit the major points, and hopefully we're a good review to hear today. So as we talked about last time, we come to the end. They say in that scripture that they say, oh, neat for Luke to end it this way because he did it on purpose, but not all of us necessarily think that that was the case. So we have what happened when we ended last time. Paul's under house arrest in Rome, even though it's a pretty freeing thing where he still has one guard. I mean, how hard would it be to just live in your house and go out the back door at the guard in the front or whatever? So he has a guard watching over him, but it's not strict. He's allowed access to other people, and other people are allowed to come and go with him. And so it's almost like having a bodyguard, if you will, in some ways, more than being like in jail or a prison. So there are a lot of questions are asked, like, well, what happened here? Did Luke write another sequel? Did Luke leave and then he didn't know what happened after that? Or was something lost? Did he write more that was just never, it got lost through the time? The trilogy, it was a trilogy originally and he picked it up then. Some people thought that maybe he wrote it up to that current moment they were back in Rome, and was almost to say, and you know the rest of the story, that I don't need to write that. We really just don't know. People have different theories, of course, about all of that, but it's an abrupt ending because we've heard other things in these last few chapters about Paul and getting to Rome and getting his case before the emperor. Now, the emperor at this time is Nero, and Nero is the 5th emperor of Rome. He ruled from 54 to 68 A.D. Of course, he's known for the persecutions and the lions and the Colosseum and all that kind of stuff. Kind of a ruthless guy. His own people thought of him as being corrupt as well, even at the time he was reigning. So he wasn't a popular figure from the get-go. His behaviors did not help him through that. He started some extravagant building things around the empire, but he didn't finish them all. Maybe people like that. I don't know. He kills his own mother. And when he kills his own mother, his reputation really does take a hit, okay? That doesn't go well. We hear about this, Nero fiddled in Rome and the fire and all that. There's no evidence that Nero played the fiddle. But there's some people say he started the fire, actually, to kind of get pity or to be the hero to fix it kind of thing. So some people think that. Whatever the case is, he blames Christians in the end. If that was his plan, it didn't go according to plan, it backfired. And so that's part of the element of why Christians, the persecution hits another level. He's the emperor when the uprising happens in Jerusalem. Remember, that's kind of been tumultuous with the Jews and Gentiles, and eventually that reached its boiling point. And so that's when the temple is destroyed. When they come in and wipe it clean. And then Peter and Paul are both martyred during his reign. So Nero's emperor when Paul gets there. And so what happens to Paul? He's under this house arrest. What happens to him? Some say, well, he never had to face the charges because basically, remember, nobody sort of came from Jerusalem to make the case against him. That, remember, we talked about in the last chapter that word had come. He goes to the Jews and says, you probably heard him. They go, we never heard of, we don't know what you're talking about. We've heard of the Christian sect. We've heard about this. We've heard that you caused trouble, but nobody has passed us a letter to, against him. So, and the people, remember, that had sort of started the trouble back in Jerusalem were not only his colleagues that he had served with, but it was some of these Jewish people who had come into the Jerusalem for the different festivals, who were at these places where it was a bigger deal and that Paul started riots, and they were the ones that sort of, the text says, instigated the case against them. Well, they never went over to Caesarea even when that part was put, but the Jewish leaders from Jerusalem went, so they go to that part, but they don't move on. So either they thought, because they had heard, remember, Festus, the procurator, and the King Agrippa basically say, if this guy doesn't appeal to Rome, we let him free right now, but he's already appealed to the emperor, so he's made his case. And so maybe the Jewish leaders are aware of that. Like, why am I going to go risk taking all this time to go if already they're saying he's not going to be found guilty? So whatever happens, it gets to Rome, and maybe Paul's under house arrest. So eventually, the single Roman guard's like, this is ridiculous. Nobody's telling me what to do. I quit, or whatever. Or they just finally say, yeah, you're free. You don't have to follow him anymore, or whatever. But others think he did have his case, that it just isn't recorded for us, that he did have a chance to go before Nero and plead his case, that the trial was brought, and that he's found to be innocent, just like the other leaders had found him before. One of the things it says that makes sort of this is that, remember when we talk about the different visions, back in chapter 27, God in one of the visions said that Paul talks about, said, you will get your chance before, don't worry about the shipwreck, you're going to get your chance before the emperor to plead your case. And so some people feel like if God told Paul that, then that happened. It's just that it would never materialize in anything, or we don't have Luke to sort of record what occurred. And there's some reference in his letters that some might attach to this time period that say, he makes reference that I'm waiting here in prison. I'm waiting, even though he's on just basically house arrest, I'm waiting for this thing to come up. So there's some sense that he gets there, and while it's not immediate, it does happen. And you can imagine that if Luke's traveling with him and after a year or so the trial still hasn't come up, it's how it is, and it's continued or whatever it might be, that maybe Luke did travel to some other place and so he didn't record it. This is all we don't know. These are all just theories in that. And then there's other references, particularly in Timothy, that things are not going well, that he's ready to die and that he's going to face potentially execution. But a lot of people put this later, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. Well, we just talked about why would Nero let him go? Because Nero is this ruthless guy. Well, this is early on when he gets to Rome. So the fire hasn't happened yet. Nero's probably not that worried about Christianity. He's focused on other things. And early in Nero's rule, he was just kind of okay. He wasn't this ruthless thing until, again, that turning point of killing his mother. So maybe he got to go. Some say that he did because one of the people that was mentioned in this is the guy who is a brother of the consul in Corinth when Paul was arrested there and brought before, and the proconsul there is like, there's not enough against you, you can go free. And this guy's the brother who's serving in Rome under the emperor, that tutored the Nero as a young kid. So would there have been some communication like, this guy's fine, he's not a problem, and so Nero listened to his tutor. Eventually his tutor is replaced. So that could have happened. So a lot of people tend to conclude that he does have his time before the emperor in some capacity, that he's acquitted, and that he begins to preach again, and then this time, as things change with Nero, he's later arrested for it and then found guilty and martyred for that. I tend to think that's probably likely. And some say between this time, he actually got to travel to Spain. And then he comes back to Rome. And in Romans chapter, I'm trying to think what chapter that is. Is it 22? That's a verse. I think it's 16. But Paul writes this himself. This is the reason that I was also often been hindered from coming to you. But now he's talking about Rome. With no further place for me in these regions, I desire, as I have for many years, to come to you when I go to Spain. For I do hope to see you on my journey and be sent on by you once I've enjoyed your company for a little while. So it is written that he wants and desires to go to Spain. And so some think he went there. This, up here, this, I know not everybody can see this screen, chapter 4 in 1 Timothy, when he writes, remember, Timothy was one of those fellow travelers along with Luke. He says, my first defense, no one came to my support. So that's another theory as well. He did get to Rome for this one. No one came to his support, but all deserted me. But it may not be counted against them. But the Lord stood by me and gave me strength so that through me the message might be fully proclaimed and all the Gentiles might hear it. And I was rescued from the lion's mouth. So some say this is Paul saying, I did have that. This is a reference to him having the trial. Nobody came, but I was acquitted. I was saved. I did not get martyred. And then church historians make reference to this as well, that he was released and tried again. And this Clement of Rome, one of the church fathers, is making a commentary on Paul's letter to Corinthians in the 90s, says this, after preaching both in the East and the West, he gained the illustrious reputation due to his faith, having taught righteousness to the whole world and come to the extreme limit of the West and suffered martyrdom under the prefects. Extreme limit to the West at that time was referenced to be Spain. So there is some kind of a little bit of evidence that maybe Paul got to Spain, but it's just points like that we just don't know. But there's no question Paul wanted to go there. He says that's recorded. And the church father, this is in the 90s. This would have been, maybe 25 years or so after Paul died, makes a reference that he sort of got to that if he's referring to Spain. But the lingo at that time did refer to the extreme west being Spain. So some people say we can connect the dots and say that this happened. But obviously, or we don't know that if his companions went with him, Luke or Timothy or any of those folks, it must have been very scant, or there's certainly no written record of that. There is some claim, and I don't know much about this at all, but there's some claim by some people that in areas in Spain that Paul was here. But there's no hard evidence to say that, but there is some claims over time. I mean, if we wanted to make the claim Paul was in Brecksville, it'd probably be good for the tourist industry. So there is some of that sometimes can go on. So you don't know when it's later, when it's centuries later. Yeah, right. Yeah. These are the. I know my hometown near Butler, and I've never been in this place, but it's called the Old Stone House. It's on Route 8 North, just probably less than 10 miles from my house. It's where George Washington slept, and it's along his trail, and he spent a night there. And so, but I've never been in this place, and they've kept it. Even during the pandemic, I drove by there once, and I was like, they're still going, and I really need to go in there and see the thing. I grew up that close. There's where Washington slept, because they have it marked along his trail and all that. But, those are the kinds of things that we like that as history, to see the place. And it's like anything else, and especially the Holy Land. If you make a trip to the Holy Land and you see these places, there's, I forget, like 3 places you can go visit where Jesus had the Last Supper. So unless they were having a progressive dinner, I think one of them is wrong, or most of them are wrong, if not all of them. But you have some of these places, too, that you go, well, here's where this might likely take place. Well, yeah, here, but this building's on top of another building, on top of another building, on top of another building, because they just build on top of things over there like crazy. And if there's anything that has something that happened in Jesus' life, there's a church on top of it, for sure. And those happen early on. And those churches, as good as they built them, are not the same churches as today. They built over them several times. There are some places where archaeologists will tell you that, yes, this is pretty authentic. And so you have to kind of watch when you go over there, and that's why it's always good to go with somebody that's pretty much a pretty good expert to say, this could happen, this is maybe what it looked like, but this, if it's the exact spot, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which has both, it's big enough, has both the place where he not only hung on a cross, but also the tomb where he was laid is in the same church building, okay? They even have a place, this is the crevice that the cross underneath was stuck in. And you can go underground, and they have it in plexiglass so you can see the crevice where the cross was and all that stuff. It's highly unlikely that those are the exact spots. But is it in the area? Absolutely. Does it look like you would imagine it to look because of the unchanged scenery and that? Yes. So you do get a sense of it. But there are other spots where I think I mentioned when I was talking about my trip there, there's Ecce Homo, which is in Latin, behold the man. It's basically a hostel where you can stay at, and then it's built on top of this. But you can go down these steps to the very bottom, and it goes down. It's really windy. It's not open to the public. They sometimes let people down, sometimes they don't. But as I mentioned, the pastor that I was with talked us, got us into things we should have never got into, including about being killed. But several times, he almost had me murdered. But we got to go down to this bottom of this thing, and back down there is definitely the road that existed at the time of was at the time of Jesus. That you can see this part of the road they've excavated. Highly likely that at some point in time Jesus would have walked on that. That would be one of the ones that would rate probably in the 90th percentile as an actual place. So that's kind of cool to see that. I mean, because we all like that actual kind of, moments and stuff like that. And so there are sites around there that are very judged to be, you can, like, they have sort of some places, this 50-50 chance, this is highly likely, this is a good potential, this is hardly likely, and you have these things from Jesus' life. You get up in Galilee, we have Peter's house. They built a church on Peter's house. That's pretty much thought to be, that was Peter's house. That's where he lived. And that church, you literally go and they've built it several times, but it's literally over the ruins, and you can look down when they got like open floor with plexiglass that's really, you can walk on, and you can see down that, so there's some spots that are really, and certainly along the Sea of Galilee, that's, and amazingly, it is not touristly built up like you would think there would be high rises and stuff all around that. And there are some off to the side, but you can be on the Sea of Galilee and look around and go, oh my gosh, if Jesus came back today and you put him on that boat, he'd say, yeah, I recognize this. I mean, it's just such because of the topography of the area and the cliffs and so forth, especially on what would be the east side, it would be pretty hard to build stuff on that. So it really, gives you a sense of what that was like. I couldn't believe how much, when I was on the Sea of Galilee, I was like, it was impressive spiritually and mentally to be on, because you're like, wow, this is what it was like. You really get a sense of that, and that's pretty genuine. So you have to kind of weigh these kinds of things that show up, and by inference or by, they call it the argument of silence, because it doesn't say he didn't do this, so that maybe he did. I've not seen this movie because I don't want to claim to have, but I know the quote from it, the movie Dumb and Dumber, where somebody says to them, well, it's 1 in a million this could happen, and Jim Carrey's character goes, so you're saying there's a chance, you know what I mean? So there is some of that you have to kind of have in your mind but certainly the topography, the area, the area, unfortunately, I'm glad I wouldn't be touristing Jerusalem today, because of what's going on over there is pretty scary. And but the old city, like I said, that's still walled, it really, you feel like you're stepping back in time when you walk through those gates. It's amazing to me how much, even though it's still very modern and there's cameras and all the, all their goods are displayed right out in front of you, all the herbs, it's just like you would imagine it to be we see in movies and stuff as far as the bargaining and along with all that all is there. But of course they have the surveillance cameras right up here too. So it's still very modern, but yet still has that look because they know it's still in their best interest for tourist reasons to keep it that way. But it certainly has a sense. The Via Dolorosa, which is the Trail of Tears of which Jesus goes around, probably the pilgrims go over to do, for Good Friday, it's not probably historical where Jesus went. And however, that doesn't mean it wouldn't be meaningful because it gives you a sense of that, and they have the stations along the way. Just because it would actually be underneath. It wouldn't be that high up in many places because things have been built up. But that doesn't, I think if people are aware of that, I feel bad for the people that are told this is the actual, because that's probably not, but it was similar, or you get the feeling of it. I think that's valid. So we have this sense of that Paul, did he get to Spain or not? We don't know. I think it could be or couldn't be. We just don't have that recorded record. Maybe that'll be the next archaeological find. They'll find the Luke says, and now in my previous book, Theophilus, I wrote 2 things. Here's the third one. Wouldn't that be a great discovery? And tell us the rest of the story, if that and such existed or not ever to begin with. There are so many books about this time. It's not like the Scriptures is the only witness to things that happened during these times. These church fathers wrote take what they heard and passing on and so forth. And, we think, well, would you be able to write much about the life of your great-great-grandchild? Your great-great-grandparent, I should say. Would you be able to write much of what happened? Because you're talking about these we today probably wouldn't know. I know I would know not even a thimble what my great-great-great-great-grandfather lived where. I don't even know where he lived. You know what I mean? But that's a different time. When you have oral history being more prominent than written history, and especially as information was passed down through the generations, you would have that sense a lot more than we know today. We now have the benefit, of course, Ancestry.com. We can find all these things. We have the pictures and photographs. Here's a trivia question, and not that I'm off course at all, but tell me who you think was the earliest president that we have a real photograph of. What number president? You don't know the name of all. We have had 46, right, presidents? Joe Biden's a 46. What number do you think we have an actual photograph of? Like, what would you guess? We have pictures of Lincoln. Do you know, if I'm right on this, and I think I am, we have a picture of the sixth president of the United States. That it wasn't while he was in office, it was in his retirement. It lived to be the 90s, and I'm trying to think, it wasn't Polk. Polk was 9. But we have a picture of Polk, who's 9. 6 is, John Quincy Adams. That there's a picture of him in his older age that they have when it first came out. That blew me away. I would have never guessed that already. I was thinking I'd be like Lincoln, because I've seen pictures of Lincoln and maybe right before him. But to go back, we think about I went down some rabbit hole of a website of ancient pictures you don't believe of people we didn't have. I saw on a video, you can YouTube this, is it What's My Line? Remember that black and white TV show? They had on there a guest, because that ran like, late 40s, early 50s? They had on there a guest who was present at the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. He was in his 90s or 100 years old. He was a kid, but he was there. That blew my mind of overlapping time that somebody on that TV show was present at the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And he talked about that. I mean, he's really old, but he talked about how the shooting of Lincoln is not what got his attention, was that when Wilkes Booth jumped and broke his leg, he remembers that as I think he was 4 or 5 years old or whatever it was. He remembers that happening, like this person jumping, and that was his remembrance of it. I thought, holy cow, I would never put those timelines together to think that was possible. So I think if you YouTube or Google "What's My Line," Abraham, you can see the little thing when people thought it's pretty. I was amazed by that. So now that I'm on Abraham Lincoln's assassination and modern photography, let's conclude here the life of Paul. He is eventually martyred. So whether he went to Spain or not, he eventually is in Rome. He eventually is arrested. He is eventually tried for preaching the faith, and he is sentenced to death. And he is beheaded, not crucified, because he is a Roman citizen, and that was one of the perks. When you were sentenced to death, you had an immediate death and not a suffering death. And that was not the case, as we come to understand from those same church fathers, for Peter. Peter is crucified, and remember what's unique about his crucifixion? Upside down, because that's his last request, that he said he was not worthy to suffer in the same manner as his Messiah, and so they grant that, and he is crucified upside down. Quite amazing. So, and then again, as this concludes, then we have the uprising starting in Jerusalem. Nero is still in power, and then it's 70 A.D. When I think Nero might just be on the way out. Yeah, but we have the Romans coming in, and they just take down the second temple. They destroy it. They don't take down all the walls, because there's still a western wall that survives, that is the western wall of today, that still exists in Jerusalem that you can go to. And then we have there's this arch in Rome that even commemorates the victory over the uprising in Judea that you can go see. In some ways, one can make the argument that the destruction of Jerusalem actually benefited the spread of Christianity, because the Jewish faith was then they had lost their headquarters, their centerpiece. Even though the Christian church was headquartered in Jerusalem, it was not tied to the temple. And so they survived. And of course, we talked about this. This is the end of the end of the Sadducees, who are tied to the temple as well. They they phase out of history. It's the Pharisees in the Jewish faith that continue, because the Pharisees were attached more toward the synagogues, and the synagogues were all over where the Jewish population was, even up into Asia, because Paul even visits some of those. So they continue on. So the Jewish faith certainly continues, but it allows the main Jewish faith in Jerusalem that is persecuting Christianity falls. And of course, we know then Christianity is persecuted in different types. It isn't total persecution all the time. It kind of comes and goes, and it wasn't uniform across the Roman Empire too. Some places you could be a Christian and not ever have a problem. Other places it could be, and sometimes it was just for a short time, sometimes longer. So it wasn't like there was this moment where all of a sudden Christians were persecuted and it just lasted until they were not. And of course, the end generally of the persecution is when Constantine converts to Christianity by his mother Helen, and then it becomes the official state religion, if you will, of the Roman Empire, which the persecution then certainly ends generally, as we talk about in big ways. It's his mother, Constantine's mother, is the one who, part of her life ministry in being a Christian, is the one who travels back to Jerusalem and starts saying, we need to preserve these things. We need to make sure these places of Jesus are taken care of. And in some cases, like I believe, if I'm not 100% on this, but I believe like the location of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is part of her doing, as far as going back and asking people where this was and where this located. And some of the other one is the Church of I can never say it correctly, Gallicantu, which is just outside the gates, and that's where it's believed that Peter denied Christ, and that's another very authentic place because of the holding cells that they have unearthed below it, and you can see and visit, and it's thought to be where the high priest was, and so that took place in that place below that, another high authentic place. But those kind of things, it's the same kind of things where even generations past, we as humans have a way of remembering certain things happen in certain places. We just really do. And so you're talking now, what is it? I start doing dates and somebody in the video is going to email me like, that's not the right date. But is it 383 AD when Constantine baptized? I'm not sure, but I want to think it's the 4th century. So if Helen goes back prior to that, we're talking, this is centuries later. But yet the locals have a way of kind of knowing where things kind of happened a little bit, especially if, they certainly would have been aware of the importance of things to people, both of all the faiths. So, it gives some credibility to it, but it's not an exact science by any means. Okay, I wanted to ask you now, on this study, any of the things, questions, if anybody wants to share, what new did you learn? What surprised you? What's this tell you about Christianity and how you see it informing our faith today? Any of those questions, anybody want to say? I was going to make you a quiz, like a final exam, but I didn't do that. Okay. That Paul was persecuting Christians initially, one of the major things. Yep.
Did you say earlier that Saul, it wasn't that his name was Saul to Paul, because I always thought because he was transformed by that experience that he started to preach, but that Paul was his Roman name?
Right. Yes.
I wrote it down. I just thought, did I hear that?
Yes. It's not a moment where God says, you will be Abraham, you are Abraham, now you shall be Abraham. That's right. That's not thought to be the case. That actually, this double naming stuff is so foreign to us, that you have different names. I don't think I can compare it to it just like sort of what your family calls you and what you write down on your business or your job application typically don't match, so you have these nicknames. Because I believe there's a part where he's back in Jerusalem and they start referring to him as Saul again because he wants to show his Jewishness even again. Mm-hmm. Yep.
The third bullet point there, what does this tell you about Christianity? That's always amazed me about Acts, is that one person telling the good news, one person, then it's just exponential.
Mm-hmm.
I've just always been amazed by that.
Mm-hmm.
And was surprised a little when the one guy was quoted, Gamaliel, I believe, saying, well, let's not worry about it. If it's got momentum behind it, it'll move. If it doesn't, then we don't have to worry about it.
Right.
And it's like, oh, is that telling?
Yeah.
You think some things that start happening, you think this is not going to last. I can remember my dad saying, we're never going to pay for cable TV.
Right. Yeah. My dad said the same thing. Yep.
He would be totally shocked at all the things that we do with TV. So it's like one person telling you something.
Right.
And then it's such a powerful message that was overlooked, was not regarded as maybe something that would stick around. And yet here we are studying this today.
Right.
I just think that's
And when we look back, and then we hear again those parables of Jesus about the mustard seed and all these kinds of things that affect, and it's like, well, that's kind of how it happened, And here we are, that sense, I think about it too as, it's that having that bowl of water and you put one drip of color dye into it. You know what I mean? While it doesn't change it to perfectly blue or red, it certainly impacts it and changes. And more little drips over time, it impacts the whole thing. And, everything is sort of a risk. We only know history from what we have recorded, too. And that's the other thing that goes, unfortunately, we have a lot of, like I said, there's all these other books about the spread of Christianity that are not meant as books for the Bible, for instance, do not make the canon or were never thought to be in the canon, but they're historical. We have these references, and as we get some of these disciples that go in these other places, and I believe it's the other James that ends up in Spain, and Thomas in India, and all these kinds of things that we have. There were certainly other people from Jerusalem that took the gospel out and spread it. They just, if they had a person like Luke to record it, it was lost. And we just don't have that. And it would be just fascinating for one of these days for something to turn up and be viewed as authentic of some other accounts of other people spreading the gospel, because it certainly happened more than just beyond Paul. Jill.
So I would say that what interested me was hearing how many times did they try to continue to grab the Jews and say, this is your story of your Messiah,
right,
and you're discounting this. And so kind of like, Paul, Peter tried to keep doing it, and Paul tried to do it, and these attempts to continue to spread the story, but especially to those that were promised the Messiah.
Right.
So that I thought was kind of an interesting thing. And I guess just to see that traveling back and forth, and again, how that eventually, how God's promises to send it out to the ends of the world, how that unfolded. This was definitely much more of an unfolding story than I maybe expected.
Right. Yeah, I mean, this whole sense of, to the Jewish faith first, and that they miss it. And you think about, well, why didn't they embrace this more? Well, one factor I think goes into that is that if we look at the chosen people's history through the Old Testament, they were always being tempted to wade into other waters of religious belief. And the fact, and we have this covenant that God says, you strayed from me, you did it, and we have this sort of recovery of the covenant promises again. And so that was sort of what happened, that they would stray, and then God would remind them, no, I've given you. And so for some, I'm guessing they're like, we can't go down that road. We've got them, we know. And it's sort of like, but the Messiah expectation, while we now, and certainly those in the early ages who put the lens of the Old Testament, of the Torah and all that on to look back at the promises for the Messiah, we can certainly see aspects of the suffering servant, of the person who's going to be, we can see those passages in there, but that's because we're coming from this mindset where there's many passages that talks about you married outside the faith, you did all these kinds of things, and you were struck down and you didn't keep it pure. And so you get a sense of why some went like, we can't, this is because, and then the expectation for the Messiah. They are a people under Roman rule. They've been a people under, and it's not too much time ahead of Jesus where this Jewish uprising happens, and they gain control of the temple that they hadn't had for centuries, and they have it for I'm going to show my ignorance here. How many candles on the menorah? 7 or 9? Is it 9? Right, so that's the time they held the temple. Remember, the oil was said to have burned. So I apologize for not knowing that number. I should. But, that was only a few decades before Jesus was born. So this sense of always being under and doing this, trying to get back to their being in charge, their Messiah expectations were always going to be like Jesus was going to come in and if it was Jesus, he was going to clean house. He was going to kick out the Romans. And that was the expectation. So to hear that he was going to come in and sacrifice himself, and by the way, if you work on a Sabbath, if you need to feed your kids, that's okay. It's sort of like, whoa, we've been teaching, these things. And so you can understand the resistance, why, that, but then others who sort of said, well, what they're saying makes sense. And, certainly the eyewitness, who mainly the main core of Jesus' followers were Jewish and had come to see that he was the Messiah. And your asked part segues right into my, the purpose of the book. But you will receive the power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and all Judea and Samaria to the ends of the earth. That is the summary of the book. That is what we're going to hear about next Sunday, not because we don't have Sunday school, but we're going to hear about, because it's Pentecost Sunday, we're going to return to the back of the beginning, and hopefully this time has hoping to enlighten that a little bit. And I wanted to conclude where we began, that I've showed to you. This will be, I think, the third time when we reviewed, but the summary of Acts in 3 minutes, because this once again hits on all those major points, and hopefully as you hear them, you go, yep. Okay?
In my former video, Theophilus, I explained the life of Christ in 3 minutes. Now I'm going to tell you the rest of the story. After being crucified, Jesus comes back to life and hangs out with the apostles. He tells them they will receive the Holy Spirit and be his witnesses. Jesus takes off. The disciples are gathered together on Pentecost when the Holy Spirit arrives. Tongues of fire hover over them, hence the logo. The disciples speak in tongues. Peter preaches the first sermon. 3,000 people get saved. God 1, Satan 0. The end of Acts chapter 2 is written, providing mission statements for churches in the 21st century. Peter heals a lame man and preaches another sermon. Another 2,000 people get saved. Peter and John are thrown in jail. They are released. Peter and John celebrate with the other believers and pray for continued boldness. God rocks the house, literally. Ananias and Sapphira lie about their offering to the church and are struck dead. Contributions skyrocket. The apostles preach again. They are thrown in jail again. An angel releases them. They preach some more. The apostles nominate 7 deacons to look after widows and orphans, including Stephen, a man full of faith in the Holy Spirit. Stephen is stoned. Present at the stoning is a young man named Saul. We'll come back to that later. Persecution breaks out, believers scatter, things look bad for the church. Or do they? Wherever the believers go, they preach the word, thus fulfilling the Great Commission. God 2, Satan still 0. Philip meets a eunuch, the eunuch is baptized. Meanwhile, Saul is on his way to persecute believers in Damascus when Jesus appears. Saul is blinded, Saul is healed. Saul repents and begins preaching to the same people he intended to persecute. God 3, Satan, well, you get the idea. Peter has a vision of unclean animals. Peter has an encounter with unclean Gentiles. He gets it. God has extended salvation to the Gentiles. Major game changer. Herod is eaten by worms. Barnabas and Paul start working together, traveling and preaching the word. By the way, I'm going to call Saul Paul now. I don't have time to explain why. Still with me? In Lystra, crowds attempt to worship Paul and Barnabas as gods. They refuse to be worshipped and are stoned. The Lystrians are a tough crowd. Paul and Barnabas survive. Paul and Barnabas part ways. Paul and Silas team up. Timothy joins Paul and Silas. Paul circumcises Timothy. Paul receives a vision of a man from Macedonia asking for help. The party leaves for Macedonia. Spoiler alert, they are thrown in prison yet again. They sing. An earthquake loosens their shackles, but they stick around to lead the jailer to Christ. Yada yada yada, more preaching. In Troas, Paul preaches for so long that a man falls asleep and plummets out a window to his death. The man is resurrected. Paul preaches some more. The man wishes he was dead. Paul returns to Jerusalem, where he is promptly arrested again. He is visited by the Lord, who assures him that Paul will testify about him in Rome. Paul feels better. Paul is transferred to Caesarea, where his case is caught up in red tape for 2 years. Finally, Paul appeals to Caesar and is put on a fast ship to Rome. The ship wrecks. Paul is bitten by a snake. At last, Paul makes it to Rome. He is placed under house arrest and continues to preach the gospel while awaiting trial. And that is all we know of Paul's story. Somewhere in there, he finds the time to write a few letters. Today, they comprise much of the New Testament. The New Testament is also where you'll find the book of Acts. The end.
All right, there you go. All right, well, thank you, everybody. Yeah. We will be with you and back, and we hope to resume Sunday school for the adults on, I believe it's the 12th, whatever that first Sunday is after Labor Day. I'm hoping we can do it with great fanfare. So, all right, thanks.